Amara has a lot of skills throughout her 4 trees, and while some of them are super amazing, a pretty large majority are kinda trash. Hey everyone, I'm Constant Canadian, and this is every Amara skill ranked. If you enjoy the video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe as it really helps out the channel, and if you really enjoy the video, then consider joining the membership program. 99 cents a month gets you a shoutout at the end of my videos, as well as these cute emotes and awesome sub badges. And for $4.99 a month, you get all that, plus early access to most of my videos. Starting off with the Brawl Tree skill, Root to Rise. This skill is a pretty basic skill that only increases Amara's maximum health, which in a Borderlands game is worthless in almost any situation. For that reason, this skill is getting the F tier. Moving on now to Personal Space, this skill grants Amara additional gun damage based on her distance to the target. The closer she is, the more damage she'll get, up to 54%. This skill is one of Amara's only gun damage skills, and what makes it even better is that Personal Space's gun damage is multiplicative with other sources of gun damage, like your class mods or artifacts, which, if you didn't watch this video on maximizing your damage, is a very good thing. This skill just gives Amara a solid boost to gun damage pretty much for free, and for that reason, it's going in A tier. Next on the list is Clarity, the Brawl Tree's final tier 1 skill that simply grants passive health regen as well as a stacking health regen upon using an action skill. Just like bonuses to maximum health, health regen in Borderlands games is kind of underwhelming. Though it is a pretty decent source of survivability early on, so it's going in the D tier. Arms Deal is the first of the Brawl Tree's tier 2 skills. Arms Deal gives Amara bonus splash damage and splash damage resistance. This skill isn't inherently bad, I just think its placement is weird. This skill would be great for Moes, but on Amara it's really only useful for melee builds. With that said, it's a pretty decent boost to splash damage, even if the splash resistance is pretty pointless. So it's going in C tier. Coming up next is Samsara. Now Samsara is a tricky one because I really want it to be good, but it's just really not. This skill gives Amara a stacking plus 5% gun damage and health regen upon dealing damage with her action skill. This stacks up to 5 times for up to 25% in both stats. The problem with this skill is that it doesn't work with Ties That Bind damage, which means it only works properly with Phase Cast and Phase Slam. This means that you realistically cannot get more than 2 or 3 stacks of this skill before they start to decay. Even if you could though, for the amount of effort that would be required to keep Samsara at 5 stacks, is just not worth 25% gun damage and health regen. Because of this, Samsara is going in the C tier. Helping Hands is yet another damage resistant skill that has no place in a Borderlands game. This skill gives Amara up to 66% damage reduction for 15 seconds upon activating her action skill. Problem is, damage reduction is a very pointless skill in Borderlands games, as by the time you've reached endgame, enemies are dealing millions of damage per second. So even with 66% damage reduction, they're still dealing more than your entire health bar every second. Because of this, Helping Hands is going in F tier. Mindfulness is a fairly powerful skill in Amara's arsenal, granting Amara stacking shield delay and movement speed whenever she takes damage. The problem is that Mindfulness is a tier 3 skill in the Brawl Tree, Amara's least versatile tree. Mindfulness is a good skill, but it requires a fairly decent sized investment into the Brawl Tree to unlock, so for that reason it's going in the B tier. Up next is Find Your Center. This skill gives Amara a passive plus 100% melee damage, as well as plus 75% increased melee range upon activating an action skill. This bonus damage is already very strong, but the increased range really makes this skill awesome. It's going in the A tier. Vigor grants Amara infinitely stacking bonus movement speed upon killing an enemy, with each stack lasting 8 seconds. Now in game, this skill says it procs on killing an enemy with an action skill, but in actuality, it will proc regardless of how you kill the enemy. This skill grants a pretty decent amount of movement speed, and with just 4 stacks, rivals Zane's Violent Momentum skill. This makes Vigor a very good skill for spiritual driver builds, especially when paired with Mindfulness. Simply for that alone, Vigor gets itself a B tier spot. One with Nature is yet another skill in the Brawl Tree that grants bonus damage reduction and max health, granting up to 25% max health and 66.7% damage resistance to her action skill element. Listen, we already know how I feel about these skills. Straight to F tier. Do Unto Others is a pretty neat concept for a skill. Upon taking damage, you'll send out an orb of your action skill element at the enemy. In theory though, this skill just doesn't do much of anything damage-wise. And being a tier 5 skill, it should at least be a little bit useful, which it's not. This skill deserves nothing more than a D tier spot, and even that's being generous. Jab Cross is another interesting concept for a skill, where dealing damage with a melee attack increases gun damage and action skill damage for a short time. Once again though, these bonuses are just simply not high enough, with only plus 15% gun damage and plus 75% action skill damage. Especially considering I would have to stop doing damage to melee and enemy for this bonus, this skill is going in D tier. Guardian Angel is a really great skill for Amara and her survivability. This skill essentially just grants Amara a free second wind every 2 minutes. This skill is great and all, and I do like it, but it's just so far down the brawl tree, and in my eyes, this makes it very much not worth it. Still though, it's a great skill and at the very least deserves a B tier spot. Alright, the first capstone, Blitz. Blitz gives Amara a passive 100% bonus melee damage as well as a melee override where she dashes at her enemies, dealing an extra 83% damage as her action skill element. This skill is actually pretty powerful. However, there is a bug with the game's code where after the Blitz animation ends, your weapon's draw out animation still plays without being visible. This isn't really a big deal as most draw out animations are less than half a second. Except for COV weapons, whose animation lasts a full second. If you don't know, the Psycho Stabber, the best melee weapon in the game, is a COV weapon. If you've been following along, that means that when you activate Blitz, while holding the best melee weapon in the game, there is a 1 second delay before you can do another melee attack. If this glitch were fixed, then Blitz would for sure be an S tier skill. But because of the 1 second delay when paired with the Psycho Stabber, this skill is left in the A tier spot. Oh, and the targeting for this skill is super buggy too, so maybe even B tier, but we'll leave it at A for now. Moving on to the Mystical Assault tree with Do Harm. This skill grants Amara a rush stack every time she kills an enemy. This skill also consumes all rush stacks upon activating an action skill, granting increased action skill damage per rush stack it consumes. This skill can actually stack up to 99 times for up to 445% extra action skill damage. Do Harm can get pretty crazy if used properly, but it does need to be set up to do so it's going in B tier. Fast Hands grants Amara bonus reload, weapon swap, and mode switch speed, up to 24% reload speed and 57% for the other two. These stats, while they aren't the most prioritized, are still pretty important for general gameplay. For a mere 3 points, this skill is more than worth it, even if it doesn't give you just straight damage, and for that, it's going in B tier. Violent Tapestry gives Amara another way to generate rush stacks by applying a status effect. It will also consume all rush stacks when activating an action skill, giving Amara bonus status effect chance per rush stack consumed. This is cool, but Amara is already really good at applying status effects, so it feels less important than Do Harm. So it's going in the D tier. Alacrity grants Amara bonus reload speed based on how many rush stacks she has, and upon activating an action skill, consumes all rush stacks, granting Amara even more reload speed based on the rush stacks consumed. Alacrity is super useful and makes reloading feel almost instant when paired with a phase or class mod. This skill is definitely deserving of a B tier ranking. Transcend is the silent killer of Amara's skill tree. This skill grants Amara a stacking bonus 27% critical damage and 60% accuracy upon activating an action skill. Now, this skill can stack infinitely, and each stack lasts around 12 seconds. That means that when combined with Avatar, this tree's capstone, and Amara's various other cooldown skills, Transcend should theoretically be at 3 or 4 stacks at all times, granting over 100% bonus critical damage. Definitely an A tier skill at the very least. Restless is a very simple skill, it just gives Amara a bonus cooldown rate, but it is pretty strong for that, granting up to 25% at level 5. It's going in B tier. Ascendant is a skill that boosts all of Amara's action skill augments, pretty significantly. Considering it only requires 1 point, I'll put it in B tier, as it's pretty useful, but would pretty much affect nothing if you didn't have it. From Rest. This skill boosts Amara's fire rate and charge time for Maliwan weapons by up to 12 and 78% respectively. This is certainly a nice to have skill if you're using Malawan weapons, but the 3 points it needs can be spent better elsewhere in other trees. It's going in C tier. Laid Bare is another pretty powerful skill in Amara's blue tree, causing any enemy damaged by Amara's action skill to take up to 25% extra damage from all sources for 8 seconds. This skill is very useful if you're running phase cast or slam, but it doesn't work properly with ties that bind, so for that, it's going in B tier. Wrath is one of Amara's only sources of gun damage, granting her 20% gun damage passively and doubling that for 8 seconds when activating an action skill. This is a pretty considerable amount of gun damage and works with any action skill, so it's going in A tier. Remnant is an incredibly powerful skill that, on gun or action skill kill, sends a homing ball out to an enemy dealing damage of Amara's action skill element. This Remnant orb also gets any overkill damage that was dealt to the initial enemy. This skill is fine in normal mode pre-Mayhem, but it gets some pretty broken Mayhem scaling which leaves this skill completely overpowered at Mayhem 10 or 11. Remnant is 100% an S tier skill, without a doubt. Awakening is another pretty simple but potent skill in this tree that increases the effectiveness of Amara's rush stacks by up to 30%. This means that any bonuses Amara gets for having rush stacks is increased by 30%, with the exception of the phase Zerker bonuses. This skill is another nice to have, but just like with From Rest, the 3 points are often better spent in another tree. Still, it's a powerful skill, so it's going in B tier. Avatar is the blue tree's capstone. This skill gives Amara an extra 10 maximum rush stacks, as well as the ability to use her action skill twice per cooldown. This skill is Amara, and quite frankly, her entire playstyle would shift completely without it. It's going in S tier. Moving on now to the orange tree, starting with Anima. This skill increases Amara's status effect damage by up to 20% and duration by up to 100%. Her action skill element gets double the bonus damage. The biggest problem with this skill is that it tends to down the player more often than is preferred, with it affecting barrels, damage over time effect, and friendly fire from indiscriminate. This skill really likes to down the player. However, it can be instrumental in increasing damage with the Unleash the Dragon artifact, so it's going in B tier. Steady Hands is a skill that increases Amara's accuracy and handling by up to 45 and 48% respectively. This skill isn't very helpful, and the only real reason anybody specs into it is because the other 2 tier 1 orange tree skills have their fair share of negative side effects. It's gonna go in the D tier. Infusion changes a portion of Amara's gun damage into her action skill element. It can change up to 40% of Amara's damage into her respective element. This skill is very useful for elementally locked weapons like the Free Radical, Hellwalker, and other such items. Additionally, it can give non-elemental weapons lifesteal through Amara's sustainment skill, which is nice. It can also be just generally helpful when fighting enemies with more than one type of health bar, like bandits and guardians. This skill does come with a couple of caveats though. Firstly, if your weapon deals splash damage, whatever portion of damage gets converted no longer deals splash damage. So if you're using a plasma coil with bonuses to splash damage, your damage might actually suffer using this skill. The other negative side effect of this skill is that it still procs even if you don't want it to, meaning you kind of have to micromanage your action skill element or you could be losing damage. This skill is powerful if you need it to be, but can also be detrimental if you don't build around it, so it's going in B tier. Tempest increases Amara's elemental damage by up to 30% and her shock damage by up to 40%. Very simple, very helpful, very A tier. Illuminated Fist increases Amara's melee damage by 75% and converts Amara's melee attacks into her action skill element. A very essential skill for melee builds. It's going in A tier for sure. Wildfire makes any elemental effect applied by Amara have an up to 40% chance to spread to a nearby enemy, which sounds cool in theory, but in practice has little if any use. It's going in D tier. Dread is another pretty decent 1-point skill that gives Amara plus 15% bonus gun damage while an enemy is phase grasped. Additionally, when killing a grasped target, Amara's weapon is instantly reloaded. This skill is very good for phase grasp builds. Definitely an A tier skill. Indiscriminate is a very unassuming skill that, based purely on the skill description, one might think is just fine, granting a 30% chance to ricochet shots at nearby enemies, 60 if the target is grasped, dealing 50% damage or 75% if the target is grasped. What the skill description doesn't tell you though, is that Indiscriminate deals action skill damage. This means that it will deal damage based on your attuned element, get that beautiful mayhem scaling, and get buffed by Do Harm. With 5 points in Do Harm, 25 rush stacks will grant you 112.5% action skill damage, meaning any negative side effects of Indiscriminate are now gone. But if you stack Do Harm with the Phase Zerker class mod, you can get up to 445.5% damage, making your ricocheted shots deal more damage than when they left your weapon. Indiscriminate is 100% an S tier skill. Deep Well increases mag size by 20% for all elemental weapons. A fine skill that only requires 1 point. It's going in C tier. Catharsis causes enemies killed with elemental damage to explode, dealing damage of that element to nearby enemies. Problem here is that the skill also deals damage to Amara, meaning more often than not it's going to down you too. 3 points could be far better spent in this tree than here. It's going in F tier. Sustainment is just a basic lifesteal skill, granting Amara lifesteal on her direct elemental damage, meaning no damage over time lifesteal. Just 2 points in this skill, combined with a Hex Grenade, can keep Amara alive through almost anything. Definitely A tier if you ask me. Conflux gives up to a 35% chance when applying a status effect to also apply another status effect of fire, shock, or corrosive to the enemy. Just like Wildfire, it's fine, but it offers little to no value to the player, so it's going in D tier. The Orange Tree's Capstone, Forceful Expression, gives Amara's gun, grenade, and shield damage a free plus 18% bonus damage of her action skill element. This skill also applies to Indiscriminate and Do Unto Others. Forceful Expression is literally just free damage with no downsides. Certainly S tier in my eyes. Starting with the purple tree now with Trust in Yourself. This skill gives Amara stacking reload speed, charge speed, and weapon swap speed every time her shield breaks with a maximum of 2 stacks, gaining 2 stacks if her shield was broken with a melee attack. Now these stat bonuses aren't really anything to scoff at, with up to 40% reload speed being an amazing buff by itself. And if you're using a shield with the action skill Start Anointment, you only need to take damage after using an action skill to gain these buffs. It's a pretty worthwhile investment early on. It's definitely going to go in the B tier. No Mistakes in Nature grants Amara up to 65% bonus melee damage whenever an enemy is inflicted with a status effect. Now, if you're playing Amara and something doesn't have a status effect on it, you're doing something wrong. This skill is basically a constant 65% bonus melee damage. Definitely A tier. Heavy Rain grants a passive bonus to splash damage and bullet speed, up to 35% and 70% respectively. Considering how many late game powerful weapons are splash damage, this skill is a no-brainer for extra damage. Though the extra bullet speed can be detrimental for certain builds, so it's going in the B tier. Go With the Flow gives Amara up to 21% bonus gun damage and 9% move speed whenever she freezes an enemy. This skill is one of Amara's few gun damage skills, and it is very easy to freeze enemies at late game, thus making this skill very easy to activate. This skill earns itself a B tier spot. Unweave the Rainbow makes any frozen enemy take 33% increased damage from melee and area damage as skill damage. This bonus is certainly nice, but it's only from 2 different kinds of sources, so it's going in B tier. Ebb and Flow heals Amara on melee kill based on the amount of damage the final blow did. This skill, while it isn't as potent as just base lifesteal, is still a decent source of healing late game, so it's going in C tier. Combo Breaker gives Amara a 20% chance on melee kill to completely reset her action skill cooldown. This skill is insanely broken, and if you're playing a melee build, you can make your action skill always available, which is incredibly useful. Combo Breaker could have been this tree's capstone, and I don't think anyone would have batted an eye. Definitely an S tier skill. Joyful Freedom is another massive boost to Amara's melee damage, granting a stacking bonus of up to 70% melee damage whenever she activates her action skill. This skill can get absolutely crazy, and when used in conjunction with the previous skill, Combo Breaker, can become Amara's most powerful melee skill as it has no stack limit. This skill and this skill alone can give more melee damage than the rest of Amara's melee skills combined, which definitely earns it an S tier spot. Burn Both Ends is another powerful skill that gives Amara a stacking bonus of up to 5% physical and elemental damage upon being damaged by an enemy, Burn Both Ends also taunts enemies whenever Amara activates her action skill. With a maximum stack limit of 15, this skill can very easily give Amara a bonus 75% damage for any physical or elemental damage she deals. And while this skill is very good, it is also very far down the purple tree, so I think we're going to have to give it an A tier spot. Body and Bind is a kill skill that gives Amara's melee attacks bonus splash damage for 12 seconds. This skill is good, especially when combined with Amara's many splash bonus skills, and even more so when paired with the Face Puncher, as we'll actually proc this skill 7 or 14 times per hit. Body and Mind is fully worth the investment for any melee build, and is fully an A tier skill. Free the Soul is another kill skill that makes frozen enemies send out 2 homing splinters that deal cryo skill damage. This skill is fine, only requiring 1 point, but it really just doesn't do that much, which leaves it in a D tier spot. Atman just flat increases skill damage across the board, up to 27%. The majority of the purple tree benefits from this bonus, as well as Remnant. Another super simple no-brainer for bonus damage on Amara. It's going in the A tier. Clear the Mind is the purple tree's capstone, and it is pretty awesome. Clear the Mind is a kill skill that lets Amara completely ignore elemental resistances for 8 seconds. Now, while this doesn't affect immunities, it does affect all resistances. This means that you no longer get a penalty for using cryo on shields or radiation on armor. This skill is an absolute game changer at late game, and more than earns itself an S tier spot. So there you have it, all of Amara's skills ranked. A surprisingly high number of S tier skills, honestly. Do you agree with my choices in this video? Let me know in the comments down below. Thank you all so much for watching, and have a fantastic day.